Thank you all for joining and making this possible, Sepideh, more. Um, yeah, so it's you saw the readings. I was quite ambitious program. I put a lot of background literature into the session, but basically I am only focusing on one or maybe two chapters of this book that I'm gonna show you now. Wait, I need to do something about what I see here. I think since I have become now the co-host, I see every time I should let someone in. Let me see, I will change this to, yeah, this is easier. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, today I would like to discuss this book. Oh, you can't see it now. Strange. Um, Robert Meister, After Evil, chapter 1 and 5. I've prepared some slides for you. The book, whenever I read it, especially these days, seems to be more, yeah, let's say, groundbreaking and I think more informative and more insightful than expected, especially these days during the genocide in Gaza. And we discussed this book also. We had him actually in our last assembly that we did with BICAR, the Beirut Institute for Critical Analysis and Research. And if you want, this reading session is a bit of an afterthought on this meeting. It was an online assembly that we did instead of our summer school. For obvious reasons, we didn't meet. We met in person in Beirut, but we didn't invite international participants this year. I'm very lucky that today, also tonight, on my side of the Atlantic, two members, other members of PICA are also joining this meeting. So I hope that they will also join the discussion. Robert Meister spoke in this assembly. It was called Palestine as Symptom and Cause. The paper that I prepared for tonight or for today is more or less a variation of this title. And I would read out, if you allow me, this first, kind of a thematic introduction. And yeah, and then I would say for the second half, I'd like to share with you my highlights of a couple of passages in chapter 1 and in chapter 5 of Robert Meister's 2011 book, After Evil, if this is fine. And already in this close reading session, I invite you to discuss with me. Of course, you can also raise questions, ask questions or objections to this introduction with which I would start now, if this is fine with you. I have roughly, with the breaks from now until, let's say, 2.5 hours from now, up to 3 hours. Let's see how far we can go. Okay, I'd like to share with you some slides first, so you can see that one, right? I start with a maybe rather weird one. Carl Schmitt, as you probably know, a right-wing theorist, also supporter, at least in the beginning, of German fascism, the theorist of, let's call it the conservative revolution as it was adopted in Germany, but a quite sharp critic of the liberalism of his age. He's as well cited in After Evil, in Robert Meister's book, also criticized later with Badiou, but I would like to highlight first this quote. It is from The Concept of the Political of 1932, the last year of Weimar Republic, before the rise to power of the German fascists or Nazis. He later reworked it in 1938. It's really worth reading these editions as well. I'm just reading this one. Humanity as such cannot wage war because it has no enemy, at least not on this planet. The concept of humanity excludes the concept of the enemy, because the enemy does not cease to be a human being, and hence there is no specific differentiation in that concept. That wars are waged in the name of humanity is not a contradiction of this simple truth. Quite on the contrary. It has an especially intensive political meaning. When a state fights its political enemy in the name of humanity, it is not a war for the sake of humanity, but a war wherein a particular state seeks to usurp a universal concept against its military opponent. At the expense of its opponent, it tries to identify itself with humanity in the same way as one can misuse peace, justice, progress, and civilization in order to claim these as one's own and to deny the same to the enemy. And his conclusion from this is, and here in bold, the concept of humanity is an especially useful ideological instrument of imperialist expansion, and in its ethical humanitarian form, it is a specific vehicle of economic imperialism. Yeah, sounds quite familiar. That is, so to speak, the formula of self-professed formula of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So civilization against barbarism once more. We know this, of course, as the formula of earlier colonial genocides, or of imperialism as mission civilisatrice in general. And I mean, maybe it's not so much surprising in that quote, but maybe it's surprising that it's from 1932, and here we have a right-wing critic of the liberal early stage of humanitarianism that is later discussed and criticized in Robert Meister. I will now switch to this introductory talk. I have actually one request. I think I should not be the co-host of this meeting, because what I see on my screen is permanently a pop-up of all those who would like to join, and it's hard to focus for me on my screen. So maybe that is possible, that we can undo this, or maybe I have to change something in my app. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm working on it to fix it, but it might take a little time. So you can go ahead.
Okay, let me see. There's maybe also something that I can do. Let me check. There is.
It should work.
That I don't get these pop-up things.
I remove you right now.
Okay, super. But then I can't share anymore, right? No, I can share still. Perfect. Yeah, it looks good. You can see it, right? You should see Robert Meister After Evil, Politics of Human Rights. Yes?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. In After Evil, Politics of Human Rights, Robert Meister formulated a groundbreaking critique of the post-1989, so the fall of Berlin Wall, Human Rights Discourse. He abbreviates it mostly as HRD. A discourse that casts the post-Holocaust security of the State of Israel as the, and this is a quote, constitutive exception on which 21st century humanitarianism is based. While HRD, so Human Rights Discourse, I use this acronym quite a lot now, consists in declaring a new post-ideological age that would, quote, repudiate past violence by endorsing exceptional violence, that of rescue and occupation, The old Holocaust functions as the foundational crime of this new age. The project and mission of preventing the return of such exceptional violence would necessitate granting the self-declared survivor and victim state, the State of Israel, impunity and constitutive exemption from international law. Meister's multi-layered argument, in consequence, implies that from a Western perspective, the victims of the State of Israel necessarily must appear as terrorist, evil, and illegitimate, as long as they insist on and fight for justice and refuse to become an innocent victim, purified of all vengeance and resistance. Hence, the dehumanization of Palestinians is systemic and follows from Israel's function as the West's techno-scientific laboratory for exceptional state violence. Within this post-humanitarian, or humanitarian, we can discuss that, battle zone, Palestinians, civilians and combatants alike are not only the physical but also the ideological target. Palestinians, voluntarily or not, by resisting Israel, also resist the current world order of HRD, which deems the struggle for justice and the age of revolution as past evil, a presumably totalitarian cycle of violence and counter-violence that the post-1990 world community seeks to leave behind, buried in an evil past. The current world order, Palestinians are asked to give up the cause and accept the post-humanitarian suspension of the critique of violence. You recognized this is of the abstract. So when I talk about the pre-HRD age, then I refer to an age, some would say it's the long 19th century and the short 20th century together, from 1789, the French Revolution, to roughly speaking 1989, the fall of Berlin Wall, and then in 91 the collapse of the Soviet Union. So roughly speaking, these are 200 years. Meister argues now that the political transitions, I'm sorry, wait, I should switch. While HRD consists in declaring a new post-ideological age that would repudiate past violence by endorsing the violence of rescue and occupation, the old Holocaust now functions as the foundational crime of this new age. The project and mission of preventing the return of such exceptional violence was necessitate granting the survivor state these exceptional impunity. I just read out the quote that you can see on your slide. In post-Holocaust debates about human rights, the violence that Israel uses to defend itself has become a laboratory for the violence that the world community, and especially the US, would be obliged to use in protecting an Israel that could not defend itself. The post-Holocaust security of Israel thus stands as the constitutive exception on which 21st century humanitarianism is based. I gave you the quote of Benjamin, of course. It is a reference to Benjamin's famous thesis on the concept of history, in which he in 1940 already said that the state of emergency, or literally the state of exception, is not the exception, but the rule. Of course, that doesn't mean that everything has become now exceptionalized, but it means that the the shift from using exceptional violence and declaring something the normal state has become faster and is more blurry. So it means that, let's say, the exceptional violence, Benjamin also calls it lawmaking violence in his other essay on the critique of violence, is something that is shown much more often. We might call this also a kind of a fascist demonstration or manifestation of raw violence, and has been normalized, as we currently can witness every day, and has become the new normal. So it is not that there is no exception and no normal anymore, or that there's no distinction anymore, but it's just that there's a new normal that is made, if you want, out of formally called states of exception. For Benjamin, it was clear that already in pre-Holocaust Europe, there was no excuse for the moralizing astonishment that exceptional acts of state violence are still possible in the 20th century. Rule and exceptions are internally interrelated in the sense that exception constitutes, produces and tests out the normal functioning of rule-conforming violence. Following Meister's argument, in the exceptional case of the State of Israel, its victims, although ultimately contingent, these are the Palestinians, also functions as the necessary exception to justify the normal legitimized use of Western state violence, be it peacekeeping or peacemaking, military invasion, war on terror, or suspension of basic human rights in the name of state security. In this way, the world community becomes the beneficiary of its own declared humanitarian mission and responsibility to protect potential victims of another Holocaust. So the argument pretty much says that Palestine is not that far, that there's a continuity of that exceptional use of violence, and the testing ground is Palestine. So there are historical contingent reasons that Israel is this constitutive exception, but there's a systemic need for such a site of, I can say, biopolitical, necropolitical, techno-scientific laboratory to test out these new, I wouldn't say measures of control and punishment and surveillance. It is, I think, much darker and much more dystopian, but they are re-imported, and there's a continuity between what is here seen as the periphery and the center of violence. Following Meister's argument, in the case of systemic state violence, the triadic relations of the perpetrator and the victims and the beneficiaries are neither symmetric nor reciprocal. Beneficiaries can enjoy their gains in the spatial absence of perpetrators while condemning their deeds. The victims of structural violence, be it class, race, gender, or etc., or able-based, can be offered compassion and charity while maintaining structures of injustice, exploitation, and submission. The classic case is here Germany, of course. Some of the perpetrators can be accused, their guilt can be individualized, and they can be either court-martialed or put on trial in Nuremberg after the Second World War, while the big group of the beneficiaries of German fascism remains, at least in West Germany, in power, literally in power, and can keep their gains. And after a while, especially now we talk about memory politics and post-1990 humanitarianism, the group or the descendants of these beneficiaries who still enjoy their gains now can finally reach out to depoliticized victims and show their compassion, and from that they develop a sense of moral superiority. They can moralize their feelings of compassion and have found basically a way, an ethical way of enjoying their gains. So I think the trick, or what maybe is the materialist underpinning, or let's say the Marxist part of Robert Meister's argument, is that he does not have the classic triad of perpetrator, victim, and witness or bystander, but he looks at perpetrators, victims, and beneficiaries. Beneficiaries are those who benefit from the ongoing victimization of victims, or the structural violence, or the, let's say, the structural impact of a certain group of people having made victims in the past and still are exploited or sidelined or discriminated against. And these beneficiaries, and so to speak, the human rights discourse is an offer to beneficiaries to not be perpetrators, but to feel good about their gains and their profits, and enjoying them without perpetrators, and giving symbolic value to victims, memory politics, memory cultures, monuments, and so on, while not changing the very conditions that have enabled social, political conditions that made this certain group a victim. Just in Germany, of course, it's clear that this refers to the Holocaust, but also to the Holocaust against other people than Jewish, basically to fascist mass murder. The continuity of these relations have been addressed by early critical theory. Of course, it's capitalism. We remember Horkheimer's famous dictum, those who do not want to talk about capitalism should also shut up about fascism, because they don't understand what is the continuity of which. Later, when we discuss After Evil, you will hear a different story. Fascism, and especially then focus on the Holocaust, is then depoliticized as kind of an abstract evil outside of history, singularized, cut off from actual liberal capitalist history, and then, so to speak, made the foundational truth or negative truth event of the new humanitarian mission, which is, of course, the never again Holocaust. And therefore, the world community, Germany, maybe the West, as its leaders, can mobilize new wars of rescue and occupation in the name of humanity. Again, that's why I started with that rather odd first quote by Carl Schmitt. So the world community, and of course that is the West. Whenever I say world community, following Meister, of course I mean the West, cast its role as an ongoing beneficiary of past evil, and we just mentioned it, colonialism, imperialism, fascism, and genocide, as the rescuer of future victims of an imagined new genocide, while denying the existence of a real genocide as it currently unfolds in Gaza. Again, it's very important to name genocide is, of course, something that the beneficiaries of past evil do, not the victim group. It has to be validated by the beneficiaries. That's why certain people who claim to have been victim of a genocide took them years. We know the Armenian case, and we see, of course, the Palestinian case now. Denial of what's going on there is part of the same structure that has created the very conditions of these structures of exploitation, death, and expropriation. Within the logic of the human rights discourse, the question of rescue and moral responsibility is only posed as long as beneficiaries of past evil are not addressed as such. As such means as implicated in current conditions of injustice, but as compassionate bystanders, acting on behalf of innocent victims, purified of all vengeance and spite. You can see that as well. A beneficiary who bears witness to the innocence of past victims can thus conceive of himself as a would-have-been rescuer rather than a would-be perpetrator. The question for the human rights convert, and we should underline here convert, is always whether it is already too late to rescue or still too soon. By agonizing over the question of his own potential guilt as bystander, the witness to human suffering, attempts to save his soul or her soul without necessarily relinquishing his position of advantage. The position of advantage is the position of a beneficiary of past injustice. I mean, you can also call it the ruling class, or if you want, those who benefit from class politics and class relations. By the way, do I explain too much or too little? You can actually stop me here. I'm just going to basic thesis arguments of the book. Actually, I can't see you, but if you want to switch on your mic, if you have anything to... Okay, otherwise I would just move on. A couple of things here to mention. The would have been rescuer rather than the would be perpetrator. It's of course clear that one would like to be a rescuer rather than a perpetrator. The German case is quite interesting here. The Germans have already made it from, their support of Israel is a kind of a fantasy play, a kind of a desired, you can say, restaging of a past, where this time they rescue the Jews from the Holocaust. The next round of that, actually, of this fantasy game is that they even, some of the major ideologues, imagine themselves as being Jewish victims themselves. This is the next level. But at this stage, this is 2011, Meister was also thinking about other cases. The beneficiaries, with being safe of keeping the benefits of their class position, of what others may call privilege, would like to imagine themselves as a perpetrator. So they have to distance themselves from, would be the rescuer, so they have to distance themselves from the perpetrators. Later in the book, we might not have too much time to unpack that. For Robert Meister, the human rights discourse is essentially, or let's say structurally, a Christian discourse. It's a Christian discourse of conversion. So it's a Pauline conversion. One believes in that mission. So one is a convert. One is not born into it. So there's a moral, let's say, purification, or if you want a more, let's say, evangelical, a reborn Christian, or some kind of conversion, a truth moment, that you see what is to be done. And that's very important, and that is also why one can say HRD is a moralization of realpolitik. Its philosophical underpinnings are preponderance of ethics over politics. So for the human rights convert, it is acceptable to intervene too early and to be blamed for the political disaster caused by it. Think about Iraq or Libya. That is acceptable. But it would be ethically not acceptable to be too late. So to be ethically on the safe side from the mindset of the human rights convert, you can accept that you basically mess up completely on a political level. You can destroy societies and states. You cause utter destruction. Now think about the last, let's say, we basically think about the wars since 1990, mostly led by America. But you could imagine yourself as an ethical person as long as you could believe that you were not too late. Think about the words of Madeleine Albright, for instance, about Iraqi children. It makes sense from that perspective, no? So this is a consistent ideological worldview, and I think he has the Iraq war in mind, the second one, when he wrote this in 2011. So once a victim group is framed as a terrorist, or an exponent of past evil, the responsibility to protect and rescue is inverted. Protection becomes persecution, rescue becomes annihilation. So victims should be good victims. Victims should be the ones who accept the gains and advantages of beneficiaries. Victims should not be vengeful. Victims should not insist on justice that would also maybe endanger the gains and claims of those beneficiaries. So if victims of past evil, let's say as the Palestinians, insist on return, on their land, on justice, they become an exponent of past evil because they're in the cyclicity of past violence and counter-violence. They still fight for justice. And according to this narrative that is here outlined by Meister, as long as you fight for justice, and as long as you have not understood the new categorical imperative that you should do everything to avoid past evil, genocide, gulag, and so on, you are basically evil. You are part of past evil. And what the Human Rights Discourse claims is that evil is past. The past is evil. So you have to become this convert that converts from history and its model of fighting for justice to become the one that accepts there had been genocide, so we do everything to avoid genocide. We commit ourselves to be compassionate towards future and old and past victim groups. We keep our benefits. No, let's say, terror, no revolution, no, let's say, no guillotine, to put it bluntly. And those who are still fighting for justice are the new evil. They are old, so to speak, from the wrong century, so to speak. And that's why they can be demonized. And then, of course, rescue, protection becomes persecution. Rescue is annihilation. And it's very interesting to see this rather bizarre and also very cynical change of vocabulary. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's something for psychoanalytically informed reading of Israeli state propaganda, how they use the humanitarian language for dehumanization. So it somehow is echoed in their propaganda. But let's move on. I will return to this because that is really a multi-layered argument. At least in the beginning of the book, with these arguments, Meister at least tries to explain why the historically contingent victims of the State of Israel are necessarily framed as terrorist, barbaric, and illegitimate, as long as they actually are fighting for justice, because they belong to that old age of revolution, past evil, this totalitarian cycle of violence and counter-violence that the post-1989 world community seeks to leave behind, buried in an evil past. And those who resist the human rights discourse and seek violent revolution or fight against structural violence, maybe claim to return to their land, regardless of their means of struggle, by the way, terrorist or not, regardless of these means, they appear in the optics of the human rights discourse as a living anachronism of past evil, and therefore terrorist. And of course, in the current world order, the Palestinians and their allies are targeted for having failed to give up a presumably outdated and therefore terrorist and anti-Semitic course. So you can say the short Oslo Accord process was maybe a failed attempt to integrate the Palestinian question into that post-1990 human rights paradigm. The paradigmatic case, though, here is, and the successful paradigmatic case is South Africa. Keep class relations, beneficiaries of apartheid keep what they have, advantages, and the beneficiaries we don't touch, but we give symbolic recognition to former victims that we can individualize and we can feel compassion with, and we call it transitional justice. Justice is postponed, but we give some transitional, symbolic recognition, truth and reconciliation. Yeah, so this is the overall framework of that argument. Again, in the second half, I will unpack this with you, looking at a couple of core passages. I thought, since I'm speaking now here from Germany, and as you heard, my accent is real, so I grew up in Germany, I should comment a little bit on the German Palestine problem, because it's actually a very good, kind of a classic case, actually, of what is in the horizon, or what is the consequence of what Robert Meister has sketched out in After Evil. So anti-Semitism is the ideological name now for a discourse that demonizes critics of the Israeli state. Critics of the Israeli state, of course, are also, implicitly at least, critics of the current world order, because they criticize the state on grounds on which this state is granted impunity or exception from otherwise universally accepted international law that also, of course, as we know, doesn't apply to the US as well. It is basically kind of international law comes as in package with the humanitarianism, the human rights discourse. And if you do not accept that, and especially if you target or ideologically target or criticize this state, you're obviously an anti-Semite or terrorist, and so anti-Semitism emerges as a discursive field paralleling, or let's say this is part and parcel of the human rights discourse. That's also why the human rights discourse, look at the German Green Party or Liberal Party, center on the fight against anti-Semitism. This is kind of their crusade as converts of the human rights discourse. So in Germany, where there is a large Palestinian minority, actually, this discourse is particularly extreme. There's state-sponsored campaigns, the racist implications you have heard about. I won't go into the details. Just yesterday, the queer pride demonstration was attacked again. There's a lot extreme police violence, but also cancellation of events, but also cancellation of people. It's a kind of a state-sponsored campaign against Palestinians and their allies, because they do not conform with Germany's humanitarian mission, and with basically the outspoken or implicit assumptions of this discourse. Endorsing a politically motivated redefinition of anti-Semitism, you heard about it, the so-called IRA, according to which criticism of the Israeli state or Israeli state action can be labeled anti-Semitic. German media and politicians have become one of the key actors of granting Israel impunity. You may add the UK, you may add France, but Germany is a particular extreme case. While Germany or German politicians cast the global role of Germany as humanitarian, liberal, and cosmopolitan, Germany maintains its position as an ongoing beneficiary of past evil. That is the Holocaust. Paid for, fine. No, there's. By the way, that's why it's not a discourse on guilt. It is a discourse on the disavowal of guilt and blame shifting towards the Palestinians. We talk about this maybe later. It's not about guilt. It's the not accepting the guilt. That's why I think the triad of perpetrator, beneficiary, and victim is so important, that Robert Meister introduces. The Germans of today are beneficiaries. So for them, it's fine. Perpetrators, they went to Nuremberg or dead. No problem. No problem of guilt. It is the Germans fighting for their business model, and their business model is to be an ethical beneficiary of past evil of your ancestors. That's the business model that they have, and this what they defend by defending Israel. And Palestinians just spoil that game, and that's why they are evil, terrorists, or anti-Semites. It's very simple, actually. So the guilt thing is wrong, really. I think we should really move away from this discourse. There may be some older generation, I know this from the generation maybe of my parents, friends, some of them at least, or my school teachers, there was a sense of guilt or some kind of unprocessed sense of guilt. But today, this is a community of beneficiaries that want to secure their gains. And their gains are secured best when they sound ethical. And they also think of themselves as ethical. And it's a really important thing that maybe is one of Germany's, let's say, best sold ideological export goods. So since official Germany is past evil, that is past anti-Semitic, the current agents of past evil, anti-Semitism, revolutionary violence, or both, can be condemned in the figure of the Palestinians, of course, and Palestine solidarity movements. In this way, current Palestinians become the externalized figure of Germany's anti-Semitic past and present. If you have access, look at Kantara. It's the platform, Middle East Studies platform that the editorial board was just exchanged to make it more leaning towards the official state line of Germany, and just look at the last articles, were a great example of how you depict current Palestine solidarity movements as the reborn Nazis, and they have their roots. I mean, you know this trope, of course, and then always come with the Mufti of Jerusalem, and I mean always the same old talking points, but you know, it is a selling point and is very popular in Germany. Coming to terms with this twisted logic, one could speak of a quasi-transcendental anti-Palestinian sentiment in Germany. It presents a key element of what Dirk Moses called the German catechism. You probably have heard of it. It was a very controversial, polemical article. I think he hit a point here, and he has a point. He called the German catechism a set of beliefs that underpins the German public discourse, of course, unspoken. It's not. Actually, it has become now also official. When you apply for naturalization for German passport, you have to actually answer certain questions. What is the right of Israel to exist, and more or less according to this German catechism. Now it has become official, actually. But let's say for those who have a German passport or a visa, this is more of an unspoken, you can say, law or normative framework that allows you to be considered an honorable member of the public that can actually speak. The concluding dogma of this catechism holds that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, avowing unconditional support for the State of Israel. This catechism does not only apply to mainstream political discourse, but also structurally organizes who can speak and whose voices are where and under which conditions heard in public debates. In a post-migrant society like Germany, this discursive gatekeeping amounts to backdoor racial profiling. People from non-German backgrounds are expected to learn and get used to this catechism and its specifically anti-Palestinian sentiment. In effect, this catechism manufactures consent to actions of the Israeli state and frames the construction of Palestinian identity under the premises of Israel-related anti-Semitism. So, anti-Semite until proven otherwise. A German newspaper even called the slogan "Free Palestine" as a contemporary version of the Nazi salute "Heil Hitler." You may say this is bizarre, but that is not accidental. German media is full of that, not only the right one, but also officially left liberal, as you know, this movement called anti-Deutsch. They really think that identification with Israel has some kind of a redemptive political horizon for them. I will talk about this maybe later. Seen through this lens of this redemptive narrative, so Germany's redemptive Zionism, Germany's support of Zionism and ethnocratically defined Israel, Israel as a Jewish state, acquires a quasi-religious character, and this is what Dirk Moses referred to with the German Catechism. So the credo, let's say one of the doctrines of anti-Palestinian racism in Germany is actually quite simple. The state that claims to speak in the name of those murdered in Germany's name cannot itself be a state of injustice. For if it were so, the calculation of moral reparation of the descendants of the Germans from 1933 to 1945, the Nazis, would not add up. From the perspective of German reason of state, the unconditional support of the State of Israel, regardless of its mode of existence, proves Germany's success in moral redemption and material reparation for the Holocaust. Again, no guilt here. Germany did what they should do by granting Israel impunity. There is no guilt left. They did this. And this is the deal. So and if you touch that, then maybe you actually point to the guilt of beneficiaries, and that is not what people like. Certain people don't like, at least. So that's basically the deal. Someone has to prove and approve of Germany as being past evil, and that's the State of Israel in this case. So it's a perfect game, actually. It's a perfect team. And therefore, Germany's unconditional, unwavering support of Israel is the core expression of Germany's humanitarian, self-perceived humanitarian mission. You have to see this together. This is an integral ideological structure. Another structure of which is, of course, more towards internal communication is German memory politics. I know I'm already talking probably too long, so I will skip a little bit. But you already get a picture. You have a desired reality, and you have a historical reality, and obviously they are not matching each other. And the Palestinians are kind of a remainder of that historical reality that doesn't fit this desired reality of Germany. But also, if you look at the larger picture, the Palestinians do not fit into the desired reality of the human rights discourse. Or, put it differently, the Palestinian case, for reasons we can discuss, could not be integrated in the 90s into the post-1990 human rights discourse. Fight for justice is over. Let's do some transitional justice, and it almost actually worked. Symbolically accept, but the Israelis actually didn't want that, and also Palestinians kept on fighting, kept on calling out. This is a kind of a Oslo is a kind of a Versailles. We don't accept that. Right of return is unnegotiable, and so on. So the Palestinian case, for reasons we can discuss, failed to be integrated into that ideological schema. We should also later actually talk about what comes post-humanitarianism or post-human rights discourse. What we witness right now, witness is actually wrong. What we see the countries many of us have passports of participate as beneficiaries and enablers, i.e. genocide in Gaza, is maybe a breaking point of that liberal form of post-1990 human rights discourse, and now we see maybe the more fascist underbelly of which was there already before, as claimed by Robert Meister. I skip a little bit. Yeah, maybe we can also skip there. I mean, this is all known, Nakba, and how this was already understood in Hannah Arendt. But maybe I will move on to, we haven't talked about a singularity yet, and I think I should do that before I end this introductory mini lecture. So the argument here is that the Holocaust is the foundational crime of the human rights discourse. For the human rights convert, the new categorical imperative is not justice as struggle, but to avoid conditions that make something like Auschwitz repeatable, or to repeat this foundational crime. In a long passage that we will later look at probably, Meister argues, puts two figures against each other, Levinas and Badiou, to argue or to counter-argue or to ask whether trauma and genocide can be a truth event. Is there any truth in the Holocaust? Badiou says no, there is no truth in trauma. There is no truth, no universal truth in trauma. There's no universalizable truth procedure or faith to truth procedure in such an event. Others say, yes, there is. And showing compassion with other people's suffering, recognizing their trauma, getting re-traumatized, has a moral value in itself. And that is the truth procedure of this new age, that doesn't want anything positive as a political project, but has disembarked, or let's say evacuated, the political scene of a fight for justice, and has entered an individualized moral universe where beneficiaries have to perform compassion with innocent victims in order to feel good about, feeling bad, as the joke here goes in the book, feel good about their never be enough compassion, but basically about their status of a beneficiary. So I should say something about how this happened. Of course, there's Aimé Césaire's famous point about that the Holocaust brought back colonial violence into the center, and also the point was that Hitler killed white people, even though you can claim that from the German perspective, the victims of the Holocaust, Jewish Europeans, were not considered white. But there is something I would like to talk about that I called the singularity effect, and without going in all the details, I'm taking this from an article that will be published soon, I think in Radical Philosophy. You can say the singularity effect is a way to dehistoricize historical events and make them mobile, and make them mobile in an ahistorically defined space. So you have the singularity effect of the Holocaust memory culture, which actually claims that Holocaust is singular, also singular as a genocide. So it is a singular historic event. All historic events are singular, of course, but unprecedented, even though it could be repeated, but it is something of its own. Anti-Semitism is not a form of racism. It's also not only analytically to be distinguished. There is definitely a difference, but analytical difference between racism and anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism is a form of racism. And in this narrative of course, the Holocaust is not a genocide, but it is a category of its own. Therefore, it stands outside of history. And if you try to contextualize it, also if you see what political causality or contexts were at stake, you basically you do a kind of a desacralization of Holocaust memory culture, and therefore you will be attacked, most likely attacked for being an anti-Semite. So the singularity effect is a mostly post-1990 side product of the memory culture, which is integral to the human rights discourse. So it's not about the event itself. I mean, there's, I think, very little historical events better researched than the Holocaust as a complex of historical facts and evidence that had been already done in the 50s. Before, by the way, it got that mythical or also religious Shoah, religious name. Before it was just called the destruction of the European Jews, and this is also Hilbert's book, and that is what it was. It was an extermination state-run or extermination program run by the Germans, who labeled people according to their signifier that they put in their passports, and in this signifier people were murdered. So there is no meaning in that, and this is of course something what is, they say, the abyss of rationality that also prompted, as you know, Adorno Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment argument. I won't go into the detail of that, but maybe to say one thing about the Holocaust as a singular historic event. Of course, every genocide is singular because it is suffered by victims. Their death is unique, and their death is singular, and a historic event is singular. But their elements of what later constituted the Holocaust were, of course, known before from colonial contexts. So more or less all of these elements you can find in other contexts as well. But for me, the most important point is why singling this out, why making it the paradigm of the Genocide Convention from 1948, and then singling it out and making it a kind of a genocide, you can say, of its own kind. So it is, so to speak, it is where singularity and the abstract concept intersect. And as a concept, you cannot attribute it to other genocides. There are genocides as plural and the Holocaust as singular. This is maybe what I would explain with the singularity effect. The singularity effect itself, actually, I took from Frederick James, and maybe we could, if there's still time, Sepideh, let me know before the first break. Do we have, let's say, 5 more minutes for that?
Yes, of course.
Super. This was the 2015 article by Frederick Jameson in the New Left Review, basically a reworking of his earlier work on the cultural logic of late capitalism, and his earlier argument that basically historical time has been evacuated or suspended, and we live in this preponderance of space over time, age. And so what is the singularity effect? He basically says, he develops it from the art world and the financial market, and without discussing, I mean, the article is quite long, all the details, one could summarize it as a late postmodern strategy of dehistoricization and decontextualization. Again, this is important to understand the singularity effect of Holocaust memory culture. Jameson warns that the concept of singularity is itself a singular one, for it can have no general content and is merely a designation for what resists all subsumption under abstract or universal categories. So he doesn't say singularity good or bad. He doesn't even talk about Holocaust memory. This is completely different context. But it is that he says there is something, at least an attempt, to find, let's say, the experiential counterpart to a world of unrepeatable now points of empty and homogeneous time. And he finds them actually in derivative trading, or in the financial market, where you bet on certain numbers and events from today's AI generated knowledge or data, and you project into a future. The future is, of course, indefinite, and this kind of singularity, the singularity of your now point T0, from which you bet on a speculative future, is what empties the historical horizon and which singularizes every second of the now where you make a bet onto the future. So every now point, so to speak, has a different trajectory in this betting. Temporality, I shouldn't say. Let's say extension of present into a speculative future. He parallels that later with the aesthetics of installation art and of non-site specific art, that you can actually privatize the public and can have art exhibitions or events that do not seek institutionalization, like a kind of a one-off happening culture, as whatever aesthetic reflection onto this unconnected, dehistoricized now point fantasy of speculative futures. And yeah, in the end, what you end with is that you have financial capitalism that produces dehistoricized bodies in space. Body is the last boundary that defines you. Badiou calls it democratic materialism. There's only languages and bodies. Bodies in space, of course, is a quote of Marina Wieschmidt's famous article. By the way, today was her memorial service in London. Our late colleague and comrade who died very early, unfortunately. It's a great piece. You should read. I should have put it on the reading list. Bodies in Space by Marina Wieschmidt. I also think, yeah, I put some slides in there. So you could say, to give a bit more meaning or theoretical content to the singularity effect, one should read it together with Marina's article on bodies in space. Maybe I'll read, yeah, the longer one. The terminology of bodies seems almost unimaginable as a simple abstraction, given its address to immediate and direct experience of the world on one's skin. Yet, it is perhaps why it functions so adroitly as such an abstraction, in turn making the relation between experience and the pervasive social abstractions of contemporary capitalist life unimaginable, if all experience is direct and the somatic is immediately, indeterminately political. So the body as kind of singular abstract, it doesn't exist, but as singular abstract, is the perfect theoretization of a world that cannot theorize social relation, symbolic order, unconscious language, and so on, where the political is without mediation, directly felt on your skin. Therefore, there is no universality, of course. It's all singular. So there is no particularity to it, also no specificity. Specificity needs some kind of universal to relate to as a particular case of some more general concept. No, everything is short circuit, so to speak, and you live then in a dehistoricized space of bodies. And I mean, this is like you can talk about this a lot. I mean, there's a new book also about, I think, Anna Kornbluh's book on immediacy, kind of ideology of late capitalism, something like that. It just came out this year or last year. It's a different ideological trend of dehistoricization and of ideologies that want to undo society, like the neoliberals always did. Society doesn't exist, structure doesn't exist, capitalism doesn't exist, social relation doesn't exist, unconscious doesn't exist, language doesn't exist, and so on. Structure doesn't exist. So the body fits this ideological universe. That doesn't mean talking about bodies is ideological, but I just wanted to highlight that this is a way to theorize such a dehistoricized world. But why I'm mentioning this, later in Robert Meister, this becomes very important, because for him, structural violence in the human rights discourse cannot be thought of anymore. Violence is violence against the body and its bodily suffering, and therefore political as singular. And so the singularity effect has really a kind of dehistoricizing effect of political language, the political imaginary. And my argument was just that you can see parallel developments also in other domains of, let's say, ideological production. And one of the sides or scenes of the singularity effect is memory culture, where you also see a singularization of historical experience, a singularization of past, and of course, ideally, a singularization of a traumatic past. As trauma cannot be universal, it is singularized for those who feel it and for experience it, and you can only make a moral claim on sharing it in compassion, even though you know you cannot, because experience and trauma is singular. So that was basically the argument on Holocaust as a singular event that therefore cannot be contextualized. Contextualized would actually expose beneficiaries, ongoing beneficiaries of the Holocaust. Oh, this is contextualization, this is historicization. And the counter argument would be, this is anti-Semitic, because you would not accept the singularity thesis. I know this was quite convoluted in the end. These were the parts out of which the general argument is constructed, but maybe I should allow for a quick break now before I move on to the slides of Robert Meister. This one actually we can skip, and before we can discuss this in detail when we look at chapter 1 and partly in chapter 5. But maybe I should allow for direct questions regarding this short but actually quite long introduction first. By the way, how was the internet? I never trust these hotel Wi-Fis.
It was very good, thank you. If
Wow.
anyone would like to ask any questions, please. Martin?
Please.
Great talk. You set this problem up very nicely. I would like to complicate the use of the word singularity with respect to the difference between the domination of space versus the reemergence of time, and point out that the term singularity comes from complex systems theory. And what we have in a moment of singularity is a fork in the road, which indicates the point where a system becomes it becomes a field of all possibilities, whereas with the spatialization of time, which has dominated our discourses since the birth of calculus, represents a moment where possible alternative futures emerge. So the singularity can also be thought of as not a movement towards ahistoricization, but can move in the direction of rehistoricization, of making the political moment a field of all possibilities. And I'm speaking specifically of the distinction between calculus, which is deterministic in terms of the past, present, and future, which is one of the outcomes of the domination of space on time, right? The spatialization of time, where you divide the world into an infinite series of still points that move from the past to the future.
Yeah.
But the moment of singularity is an indication where it becomes necessary to use the language of phase space, which is a smooth space which is irreversible with respect to time, and in which individual dots are mapped in this geometry, which indicate the range of possible alternative futures. And one would always want to look at a moment like we are in right now as a field of all possibilities, indicating something different from where we seem inexorably bound to conclude or to resolve.
That was really helpful.
I hope that was helpful. I think this is really wonderful stuff, and can't wait to. I'm not sure if I have the time to hear the second part. I'm going to be really upset if I have to leave, but I'll just leave my thoughts there, and because I also thought that this important distinction in the philosophy of science might be of use to you as you move to your second.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. This is really important. And in chapter 5, actually, even if you leave earlier, read chapter 5 and his discussion, Meister's discussion of Badiou. So very briefly, of course, that what I said, singularity effect is not against singularity. It's ideological abuse of a concept that also doesn't make sense. Ever since Hegel, the syllogism, particular, the singular, the universal, and you can of course link them in different ways. So you cannot undo it. Rather, you need a materialist. I think you need a materialist theory of singularity. Badiou has one. There's others in Deleuze, and the philosophy of science gives us others. But one.
Deleuze is drawing on this philosophy of science, and
yes, I just wanted to give you one remark towards possible futures. I think it's the strongest point in Badiou, even though I'm not a Badiousian, but I always found this kind of fascinating. The moment they have possible futures that could calculate and bet on, that is not the side of the event. He would say is change, something that exceeds the ontology of now, is something of an eventual side that, there has this truth procedure, and that an après coup, retroactively will be established as an event. But I would say something that exceeds all possibilities. So it can exactly not mapped. So it's kind of an interesting singular future yet to come. Sorry for sounding Derridian, but it is not possible from the moment of speech or of political judgment of the now. And I find it's very interesting that he can actually think of the unthinkable, of a singularity that is not deducible or reducible to from the moment from where this political agency, you or I or others or our collective or political party or whatever, can make that betting or like this projection from where the realm of possibility arises. And I think this is interesting. But I mean, you can say Holocaust memory culture in Germany is a very sad thing where they just fight over an interpretation of a foundational past against history, basically, against the whole syllogism of the particular, the universal, and the singular, and to take the singular out and was kind of a revelatory negative truth event from which they think their moral elevation is derived. It's very Christian, and Robert Meister is totally clear. This is a convert style Pauline figure, and that is part and parcel of these, human rights discourse. This type of singularities are called singularity effect, I attack. So I think it's very helpful that you reminded us of, let's say, the materialist and proper use of the term and the concept. And there's a lot to say. Actually, we could do seminars and seminars on that.
Absolutely. Somebody who I like is Isabel Stengers, who's done a really wonderful job laying out the political dimensions within the debates within philosophy of science and science itself over this struggle between time bound and time reversible or spatialization of time. But the other point I would like to make is that this triadic distinction between perpetrator, victim, and beneficiary can be mapped out with respect to racism in the United States and the ways in which Jews became honorary whites and therefore the beneficiaries. And there's a real split within the Jewish community between those of us that identify with people like Walter Benjamin would take one side of the equation. But I also find it really interesting that you brought up Schmidt, because I mean he's really at the heart of Netanyahu's real politics. So anyway, let me just stop there and let other people.
Sami, do you want to take a break or do you want to take more questions?
I would say maybe we could take questions directly now, because now the introduction is still in our mind. We can also do this later, but I would say one quick round and then we need a break. And then we start again with remaining questions on what was only considered to be an introduction, and then we actually do what we were supposed to do, why we are meeting. It's looking at chapter 1 and 5.
Great. Daniel, would you like to speak?
Yeah, just to mention in relation to the description of the violence lab of the exceptional state, of the laboratory for exceptional state violence, I was writing in the comments that the particular group of militaries that founded the paramilitary groups in Mexico were trained by Delta officers and Israeli officers, and the particular Zetas group is an example of how this violence is exported, and it was at first government related, and then it went out of hand. That is that is it.
Yes. You can see it with the special group, special forces, which is more of, let's say, a 1960s, 70s, 80s thing. Now Israel is more, kind of leading in spyware. So if you want to harm your neighbor, you would hire probably an Israeli company that finds some online stuff, and
it was a national debate on the Pegasus spyware, because at that moment the current government was accusing the past government of using it, but now the current government is more like the past government, so they don't talk about that very much. And we
exactly
that in the yeah, it
Yes.
was a national discussion. It was in the news all over the country, but it was a politically motivated debate. It was used by the current government to attack the past government.
Yes. This, but also others. I think this is very clear. I think have felt globally by everyone that this necropolitical laboratory for new weapons of mass destruction and of new, more advanced, let's say, AI based weapons, be it drone warfare or just calculation how to effectively destroy every life in confined space. I think these techniques will be exported. Partly they are already exported, and I think that makes also the this genocide specific, also historically, as I wouldn't say an event in the Badiousian sense, but it is specific insofar that the most sophisticated technologies of our age are here put to use to total human and non-human destruction. And that is shares definitely with few only earlier genocides. And this would call for comparison, because you may say that there are genocides with more conventional weaponry, and there are ones where very advanced technologies are used that are later exported to exactly those countries, are already exported to the countries who ideologically, materially support this genocide. Not just enabling, they're supported. Yeah, there was another
Yeah, there are
question.
2 questions in the chat from Will and Devon, if either of you would like to speak. If not, you can read them, Sami, or I could read them aloud. Devon says, what role do you think technology plays in the memory dynamics of the singularity events, for example, the virtualization, digitization of trauma and suffering and its subsequent dissemination and propaganda usage? Oh, Devon, you may speak, please.
Oh, yeah, sorry. My internet was having some problems, I think. But yeah, specifically, I think in relation to Flusser and like the dissemination of images, and I guess I don't know if you've read recently Amy Walston's blog post on the Do Not Research Substack, but she is basically talking about this phenomenon in relation to Gaza and Palestine, where the images of suffering are deployed strategically to basically cover over any reality of what is going on there. And it creates like this point of indeterminacy where it's difficult to even make conclusions about what events are transpiring there.
Say it again, the last one. It makes it.
Oh, it makes it sometimes difficult to draw conclusions about like what events are transpiring. Yes, so.
Yes. No, I was just trying to find the question in it, or
I guess, yeah, just what, like, how do you think the memory dynamics have shifted as new technologies and ways of digitalizing or essentially like memorializing
yeah.
events are?
I mean, you could. It's hard to make the argument on what comes first, right? You would say that the accessibility of memory of the cultural industry of memory through digital distribution and production is a quantity that is so, or has a reach that is itself a quality of its own, and that would actually make a difference. I agree to that, but there is a systemic need for it, because memory politics, and I haven't actually read out this part, is the undoing of history, so to speak. The undoing of history, where you can memorize atrocities or singular traumas without engaging politically with a history that is part of a totality. And this totality has a context, and that is also will live longer than you. And that comes with a charge of negativity that you cannot memorize. Memory, I mean, of course, is in Freudian terms, you would call it a cover memory. It has nothing to be memorized. It's an ideological product of a society that creates an image that it would like to have of its own. And I think that's why it's part and parcel of the dehistorization after evil human rights discourse. That's clear. But you may argue that it is only really possible to undo that historical consciousness once you have a digital media. Yeah, maybe you can.
Thank you. Also, Will, if you'd like to speak, you may, or I can read it aloud. So the question is
I
just
can read.
oh, go.
Could you please, this is sort of what you just said, but could you briefly clarify the latter part of the argument, which is this thinking in terms of singularity and bodies through
Yeah.
memory culture? And then I just didn't quite get the last
Yeah.
bit of the argument.
It was way too short, and you're absolutely right. I'm sorry for that. But the discourse on bodies as something that promises immediacy, doesn't need mediation, doesn't need the universal and the particular, but is offers a direct access to singularity without being concrete actually about that, is something that could fit the argument on the singularity effect sketched out by Frederick Jameson. Now, what you get in the end in a dehistoricized space of capitalism, where you have basically a multiple choice, and the choice actually, the agent of choice is not you, but AI probably, calculation of infinite extensions of the now points in which you live. And such a world of undoing history, because history needs symbolic order, needs context, need meaning, need interpretation, and so on and so on and so on, needs structure and the unconscious, you name it, that in such a world, I mean, again, this is a fantasy, it's ideology, there is maybe a certain, let's say, ideological purchase in siding with the discourse on the body, because then it was only body and language as what the two elements that would constitute democratic materialism according to Badiou. And Badiou, of course, says there's bodies, there's language, and there's truth. The moment there's truth, there's someone who disputes the truth, there's negativity, there's history, there's revolution, there's politics. You see, so the idea of undoing politics and undoing history, undoing, there is no alternative, there is no real change, there is no event, there's no society, to quote Maggie Thatcher, the arch neoliberal, would somehow be congruent, ideologically speaking, with a certain discourse on the body as that abstract singular. And that is, I think, very well unpacked in this critique of ideology of the discourse on the body in that article by Marina Wieschmidt. That's why I introduced it. But only as a case study of what remains in a dehistoricized space. What is the theoretical, whatever, discourse? Not even theoretical discourse. What is the discourse once you undo politics and history? What remains? Plurality, difference, language, body. And body, of course, comes with, it's abstract but immediate. It's your body, You can feel it on your skin, it's something of immediacy. Of course, you heard already, I'm a crypto-Hegelian, so I say immediacy is also mediated. Sure, experience is also mediated. These are ideological tropes, but I just try to make sense of an ideological, of a conjuncture, ideological conjuncture that can operate theory and ideology without history, even though we would probably all agree that there is history. But, just to make sense of something without history. And once you have undone history, you have no problem in singularizing certain foundational pasts. Because there is no other, there is no general concept anymore under which you can subsume and subordinate particular cases. You tell me I was discriminated against in a racist way. I would say, yeah, well, what is racism other than your individual singularized experience as singularity? And you see, of course, that is exactly the fallacy of that type of discourse. Whereas we would probably agree that racism is a structure. There is a universal to it, there's a particular to it, and a singular to it. Otherwise, it is not a political category at all. That it would be completely relegated to the imagined interiority of body and singularity. And this is what you get, I think, once you have ideologically evacuated any symbolic order that would go by the name of history, politics, and so on. And then, of course, this works very well with this liberal fantasy of the human rights discourse, when there are bodies, language, compassion, and trauma. And that works very well. I mean, I'm not saying it leads to those genocidal ideologues that we have problems with now, but I just say this is a current version. I mean, the right-wingers have also updated their language. So it works with the current liberal fascist apology that manufactures consent to genocide in Gaza. It works. It works because it can work with a singular past that is the singular source that derives, from which they can derive the authority of speaking in the name of an exceptional victim that has exceptional singular security needs, and that is worth any Palestinian death. That's the argument. I mean, it's not an argument that I buy, but that is, so to speak, a fantasy that's being produced. That's why I brought in bodies as, or a certain discourse on bodies, as an example of what remains once you have undone, you did away with history and politics, and you will have this kind of ethical preponderance over the political, and you have an individualized moralization of feeling, and yeah, the interiority of your psychic life as imagined through the body. Sorry. That was long, and I should have really unpacked this properly, so I still have to say, maybe this is something we can do in the second half much better. And I already see that in this article that I will publish in Radical Philosophy, it needs to be unpacked. And I think what I have said should be read next to Marina's article. And I haven't put it on the reading list, so maybe it wasn't a good idea to bring up this argument. But it was just, it struck me, the formulation that what you get in a singularity effect universe is dehistoricized bodies in space. Okay, I think we need a second try. Sorry for that.
Okay, how long of a break would you like?
Thank you for posting it. Yeah, thank you. The article, I see it now in the chat. Oh yes, and the movie by Lanzmann, Shoah. Exactly, that's the case. It's the prime case. I had this in mind when writing that. Thank you for making this argument as well. And reminding us of it. Hi everyone, I'm trying now to share the slides. Not starting yet. 1 second. Okay, this should work, right? Yeah, that's the book.
Yes.
I hope you can, those who are already online can see that. It's the table of content, and cool. Thank you. Yeah, the first slide, we can slowly start, is still from the introduction. And I found it quite helpful to understand what he means with the evil of genocide and why the post-1990 human rights discourse ideological formation centers around the negative truth value derived from past evil. Why this is so important? I mean, the book is called After Evil, and his argument is that the human rights discourse as a post-political, post-historical fantasy of the political and of history thinks itself beyond evil, and it persecutes and demonizes those people and groups that it identifies with past evil. Maybe I read this out very briefly, and then I would actually jump to the first chapter. The evil of genocide as a universal ethical truth takes priority over the contestable, culturally relative notions of good on which politics might otherwise rest. So genocide as something that maybe is specific to a group or to survivors, to victims, is now the side of the event and of universal truth. Interestingly, it short circuits singularity and universality here, while political struggles over, let's say, pursuit of happiness or a liberal version or class struggle would be relegated to the realm of culturally situated relativism. So you see, this is the post-political notion where universality and event moves to the side of ethics and to, let's say, commemorating an evil past within and its foundational event. And to understand that has the character of conversion. The convert from bad politics, justice as struggle and fight, and the cyclicity of violence and counter-violence, which is here understood not as structural violence, but as violence against the body, I guess. It's bodily suffering, cruelty, is not the side of ethics that supersedes politics. An avoidance of that evil must now replace the pursuit of good. Fact must replace illusion as the ethical foundation of a universal politics-based human rights. Again, fact must replace illusion, of course, is another illusion. What is a fact? We don't have to discuss this here now today, but you understand it is understood as post-political, post-ideological. We don't believe in utopia, we don't believe in anything, we just don't want this. So the avoidance of something takes the place of political program or something to strive for. But of course also then a different future that is radically different from today is unimaginable. There's only the idea of staying ethically after evil and keeping evil at bay. And also then, of course, demonizing those people who demonize other people because they have identified people who benefit still of their own suffering. I mean, that maybe you can say is the struggle against critical race studies, or they call it post-colonialism now in Germany. I mean, basically discourses that point or expose people and ideologies that, are here called beneficiaries. And beneficiaries, again, want to enjoy their gains in an ethical way. So you can say this is an ideological project, this human rights discourse for catering to beneficiaries, of course. If committing genocide is undeniably evil, denying genocide helps to make that evil possible. Yes, you would say, but now we see that denying genocide is part of the human rights discourse, at least in its humanitarian, in its hegemonic version. So naming genocide is also something that is left to beneficiaries. Or victims that have been granted pure innocent victimhood has been recognized as those by beneficiaries, not by perpetrators, of course. So the great case is actually Germany intervening into the international court case against Israel. This is a beneficiary that fights for its own version of the past, of being after evil. Denying genocide is that German program, the name and project of which is acknowledging, but the correct genocide only, not the one that fits that narrative of Germany being after evil, past evil. The denial of genocide by third parties thus contributed to the evils of the 20th century. This can be made, this argument, as long as this genocide is in the past, obviously. Same goes with colonialism. You can condemn colonialism, the perpetrators of colonialism, while maintaining your position as a beneficiary of colonialism. Therefore, it must be in the past. It's past evil. If you address a hot colonial case in the present, you see what happens. You will be targeted by the right-wingers for that. That's why also framing Israel as what it obviously is, a settler colonial project. And it is many projects in one, but it's let's say, most specific character, settler colonialism, that this is controversial. It wasn't controversial for the old Zionists who were part of old evil, according to this book. Has become such a thing. Yeah, after those evils, third parties can no longer make excuse that rescuing victims, when possible, would involve choosing sides in a political struggle. So rescue is not political, no, it's just humanitarian. I mean, according to this fantasy. Those who deny genocide put politics, the pursuit of goods, ahead of ethics. So the anti-Semites, the genocide deniers, the old evil people, those who fight actually for something, they still put politics ahead of ethics, which should be reversed according to the new human rights discourse. The ethics of non-evil must now come before concern for whatever politics may follow from a bystander's act of rescue. I had mentioned this already earlier before, that rather act early and intervene. This is ethically good, regardless of the political devastation and catastrophe that is unleashed through this act of interference. And of course, bystander here you see, and then you should add inverted commas. The bystander is the bystander of a group of beneficiaries. Mostly in the cases, yeah, it's the US, the West. Who were the last rescuers? France, UK always, US, Germany a little bit. Yeah, I mean, you know those countries. Again, this is still introduction. Skip a bit. But by the way, stop me if you have other parts that you would like to discuss. I thought these are just the ones, I think these passages that I would like to talk about. By the way, if you want, we can also have others to read out those passages. I don't need to read them out, but I will just do it once you, as long as you don't stop me. Oh, there was a question. Yes, a method of creating memory which releases the beneficiaries from guilt without having to contend with how they have benefited and continue to benefit. Oh, exactly. I mean, why do you have memory politics at all? Why do you have a state as actor of memory politics? Memory is something individual. Why do you need the state for that? How can memory politics and a culture to generate that replace history? I mean, this is the whole point. I always have this debate with actually Germans who think, but there is a good version of memory politics. They talk about a remembrance, culture of remembrance of the Holocaust. Sure, there is, but that wasn't a state-funded project. That was what people actually believed as good. We should know to not repeat the past. Of course, you can say, if you want to extract pedagogical lessons from history, you might fail. But you wouldn't say this is inherently bad. But once the state becomes the main actor of that, look at the case of Germany in the 90s, you know that these are beneficiaries. And again, the guilt, they have guilt, they are guilty, but they don't have the guilt consciousness of which. So the whole point of that memory culture scenery or show, or not show, it's a stage or discourse, is a disavowal of guilt. That's the starting point. If you touch upon that, when you say you're benefiting still from the same structures, you might get into real trouble. People don't like that. So I think it's a good point to point this out again. Yeah. I mean, Meister is very clear. He has amazing one-liners, and of course, unpacking them takes then 100 pages always, but I'll give you one. Post-1989 Human Rights Discourse, HRD, must be understood as a critique and supersession of early ideas of revolutionary struggle, in which the way that the post-1789 French Revolution doctrine of the rights of man must be understood as a critique and supersession of the feudal ideas that it put in the past. In this respect, it is not an unqualified triumph for those ideas. So he really offers us here a historicization of an age of HRD. I mean, he historicizes an age that, according to his ideology, believes is beyond a certain history, at least. I mean, you would say that is a classic Marxist take. The main idea, so I'm just reading the other one. The main idea that post-Cold War humanitarianism, so post-1990, HRD, claims to supersede is the revolutionary concept of justice as struggle. Revolutionary ideologies, whether Marxist or not, you can put in the Palestinian case especially, typically had a social theory to show victims that their suffering has beneficiaries, and a political practice aimed at provoking those beneficiaries into siding with the perpetrators when their benefits were threatened. That's when you call the police, or you call the fascists. That's what the German bourgeoisie did in 1933. By recognizing the beneficiaries of injustice as would-be perpetrators, victims would achieve the heightened consciousness necessary to liberate themselves through revolution. I mean, that's the old model. So it's a nice formula, very, short, maybe not nuanced enough, but we understand now the perspective from which Meister looks at the human rights discourse as to supersede this precisely. So he, of course, reads the human rights discourse as a continuation, as the latest edition, the most ethical, if you want, edition of the old counter-revolutionary project. And it's quite interesting that those critics were also already there on the right by the time. But the right, or the center-right, has moved into the fields of the human rights discourse. Not the super right-wingers maybe today, but mostly. A side element that we might not discuss today, but of course, the more ethical you produce yourself, the more virtuous signaling you produce, the higher your need of ressentiment, old Freudian idea of repression, you will produce as well. So that the typical result of human rights discourse moralization of feeling is right-wing populist fascism, like Trump. Like the mobilization of ressentiment that is created through too much super-ego moral injunction on this subject. Nobody can bear to be called out to be, to be policed on your feelings. This really drives people mad, and that is also the success of current fascism. But it's not against the human rights discourse. It is its twin. It comes as a package. Both try to supersede and to defeat this old formula of justice as struggle, which from the perspective of the human rights discourse proponents would be totalitarian. Because you have to fear the rage of former victims. When they gain power, they might take revenge, and they might take down not only perpetrators, but they might gonna go for the beneficiaries. At least they will expropriate them. It might not be nice. And of course, this is on the cyclicity, terrorism, counter-terrorism, terror, contrast, you have it. You can read that. Thus, the political trajectory, just reading the yellow highlights here, of revolutionary justice is to create enemies until it is eventually defeated by the enemies it creates, first morally and then politically. This is the old model. In revolutionary justice, the victim is to become victor. The problem with this concept is that nothing counts as winning except continuing the fight. You remember Marx, communism as the real movement of history. But the problem with abandoning it is that has nothing counts as justice if it is not worth the struggle. So when do you declare revolution was successful? When you can go kind of back to business or whatever. So permanent revolution, we don't need to quote Trotsky for this, but there is an idea of, there's an open-endedness to that, and so the human rights discourse ideologues would say this is exactly the totalitarian. This leads to the gulag. You will never stop. So we need to abandon justice, transitional justice, and let's focus on individuals' pain, individual suffering, and start from there. Justice is postponed forever. So the cost of achieving a moral consensus that the past was evil is to reach a political consensus that the evil is past. So you would call that a self-congratulatory approach. I mean, the past was evil sounds like bad news, but the evil is past sounds like good news, and you're part of that project that keeps evil at bay in the past, unless you are someone from this old evil, and I'm gonna persecute you. Because if you are a proponent of this old evil that goes after beneficiaries, then you are demonizing people for their benefits, then I'm gonna demonize you. And that's exactly, I think, you can see this live. The Palestinian case is very obvious, but you have other cases, of course, especially settler colonial cases. I mean, all of them. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, by the way, of course, I said this session now is open, but I can't see all of you. Sometimes I also don't see the chat just directly. So I think the easiest way is to open your microphone and just talk. Yeah, I mean, I think you made this point here clear. There are a couple of passages I'd like to highlight with you. This one is, I think, very important here, the second one. Beneficiaries of past injustice are expected, when the story works, to identify with individual victims, or at least with their pain, and also to see themselves as victims, now that they know the truth about the regime they once condoned. Yeah. Who do you think of? Who is that? Who do you see when you read such a sentence? I mean, in your imaginary eye. I mean, these are Germans reading Anne Frank diaries. Very clear. But not only, but that is the way how it works. These are Germans who are shocked watching the American series called Holocaust in the late 1970s. Oh my God, there were humans like us. Incredible. We can identify, now we are past evil. Now we can actually identify to be also Jewish, without having really accepted the guilt, the historical guilt, without having worked through the structures that puts them in continuation of beneficiaries. I'm talking especially about West Germany here. We still have those nice brands that the Nazis also liked, by the way, even the brand name. But that's another story. You will find other examples, but I think this one is a very obvious one. Sepideh, could you help me with the chat? Because otherwise I can't see two things at the one time. I'm a one tasker, unfortunately. Or
Yeah, sure.
Anyone who wants to help me.
Yeah. Devin, are you there? Are you there?
The easiest way is actually
Maybe
not to
can
use the chat, because I won't see it probably. To
Okay.
just speak into the mic if you have a chance to do so.
Yes, please raise your hands and speak. And otherwise, if anyone see a text in the chat, please remind
He
us.
quotes here Schmidt. I mean, Schmidt I also have quoted. I think it's not probably not underrated, but I think everyone should have read once An Intelligent Right-Winger. And I think he sets the bar quite high to understand what you need to criticize liberal democracy and understand the pitfalls of humanitarianism and what is needed to criticize Schmidt on the level of the height of his own argument. Meister does that quite well, I think. He also uses Badiou for this purpose. But he also uses, of course, Schmittian arguments here, that humanitarianism precisely doesn't do away with the enemy-friend distinction, which is constitutive of politics in the Schmittian sense. I put a little note here. Every accusation is a confession. You have heard this, of course. My computer says I should switch on the sound. Just for the purpose of sound check, can someone say something so that I can hear?
Can you hear me?
Bravo. You don't need to do the sign. You can directly interrupt me because I don't see the screen is too small. You can just go ahead, please.
Okay, then I'm going to read the previous comments I left in the chat. Can you hear me now?
Chat. Yeah, okay. I can go to the chat, of course. Wait. The sound is bad. You are right. Which one did you write?
Bad? Can you hear me now?
Sound is not
I
very
think
good,
that-
unfortunately.
Yeah, that's why I use the chat.
Okay, can you then put it in the chat? And I know now that you will write in the chat. Daniel, yeah, please do. Yeah. But you can also alert me to I have put in the chat, or maybe that's why I need you, the organizers, to help me. I won't see all of it. If I want to read the text, I can't see all the windows. It would be sad to miss.
I couldn't see the question. If anyone see the question, please.
Yeah, and use as much as you can the microphone.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Super, yes.
My first memory, and it was directed by a Jewish professor, but beyond that, I traced some instances of collective memory before the 20th century. And so there's a discussion of the spirit of the collectivity of the group in a letter regarding the festivities of the town festivities. Then you can find it in the second intempestive, where he precisely discusses the manipulations for the intentional use of memory as a tool for Nietzsche. Maurice Halbach also wrote about collective memory, but on the framing in 1925. He died in the concentration camp and left a book on collective memory, posthumously published in 1950s. And I think that the important part is more the politics of memory, the performative aspect of it, memory, the process of conversation and the construction of an event via consensus. And in the thesis, I also this coincidence or with however communicative action.
I have to admit, I don't get all of it, and would be sad to not answer you correctly. I have to ask you for using the chat. I heard it is about memory politics, but I didn't get the full sentence, so I need to ask you, unfortunately, for the chat. I'm sorry. Sorry for that. I will read it. I will read it. Sepideh, once it's written, you can read it out maybe, so it's easy. So, we still have some time. I have a couple of points I would like to still discuss with you, if this is fine. As you already saw, the point of the victim is now the point of a desired identification for the beneficiary. Once you have, let's say, undone or put away with, or imprisoned, or symbolically got away with, got rid of the perpetrators. So to be a victim is precisely to experience oneself as the object, as he writes here, of hostile desires that one does not experience oneself as having. The subject of that desire to torture, intimidate, humiliate is always imagined as someone else who can then be properly blamed for acting on them. Thus, blaming is a direct way of experiencing oneself as the object, as victim, of desires on which it would be reprehensible to act. It is also and indirectly a way of innocently re-experiencing the desires that would make one capable of having victims in one's turn. It's a very troubling thought what he brings up here. But I think a shorter version would probably be to say every accusation is a confession. As you have heard in the recent genocide, especially in the beginning, claims the Israelis made in the end were almost kind of inverted wishes or desires that could be, put on the other, projected, and then done, actually in reality done later. So it's a kind of a very unpleasant, troubling, unsettling inversion that we see here. And I think one should take this seriously. And I think part of, let's say, the Israeli psychosis is that victim part. So to precisely experience oneself as the object of hostile desires that one suppresses in oneself. Of course, it sounds like a bit of kitchen table psychology, master psychology, but I think he has a point here. I won't go into the details of the Melanie Klein argument, which are actually quite interesting, projective identification. But I think it is a really important point. Projection, or what I disown in myself and I see in you, and projective identification is Klein's clinical term for the phenomenon of re-experiencing our own feelings as though we were the object and not the feeling subject. This, she argues, is the internal process through which we defend against our sense of loss, abandonment, or betrayal by identifying ourselves as innocent, undeserving objects of persecution. In politics, projective identification can refer to either one's recognition in others of what one refuses to acknowledge in oneself, or to one's rediscovery in outside reality of what one does not wish oneself to be. Again, think about seeing a genocide while doing a genocide. acting as innocent victim while projecting what you disown in yourself onto the other, or splitting yourself and abandoning and identifying with an idealized version of yourself. So this is very important for what he later describes as showing compassion with the victim. So these are basically clinical or psychoanalytical terms and theories to unpack what is at stake when members of the beneficiary group want to empathize with individualized victims. And also the reverse, when those beneficiary group people go after, let's say, proponents or members of a group identified as being members of past evil and persecuting them, even torturing them, in the name of human rights. But I should go back to Daniel's question because I think it's now in the chat. Yes. Some moments of collective memory discussed in philosophy. Rousseau's letter to D'Alembert concerning spectacles thematizes collective identity and shared experiences, needs to discuss this memory as a tool for social negotiation with cypherx. Yes, I mean, that is, I hope you understood that it was not against memory. We talk about memory politics where the state has become the agent of memory politics and does the monuments. It's not about a collective memory. A beautiful book by Enzo Traverso about what collective memory can do also as a source of struggle. I'm not talking about memory since the 1950s. I'm talking about a very specific memory that is the result of the human rights discourse of the 1990s. Even though it has the same name, memory, it doesn't mean that. No? I hope we understand each other what I'm talking about. No, this is not that. It's a bit the same with singularity. Singularity is not bad, but we talk about the mobilization of something by a state actor for clearly, I think for identified ideological purposes. And I think one should not underestimate the ideological, I may say, enemy here, because precisely because singularity can have an emancipatory meaning, precisely because memory has an emancipatory meaning, it comes from grassroots non-hegemonic struggles, precisely because of hijacking this vocabulary, it is so successful. Who would be against human rights? That's the whole point of when a state hijacks this language. The point is now to understand how those, let's call it, ideological pieces, almost like in a toolbox, fit into each other to create this human rights discourse. And memory politics, which relies on an outsourced memory culture, half state funded to NGOs and so on, is basically a part and parcel of this post-1990 human rights discourse. And the sad thing is that when actually attacked for that, they would answer in a very similar way. But wait a moment, all those people talked about memory. Why memory is not bad, Of course not. That's not the point. That is how you use memory to undo history. That is how you have basically created the fantasy of history is over, because history is an evil past that is in the past. And now what we commemorate is what a state has organized in, produced as a foundational crime of that age that would call for the exceptional violence of rescue and occupation. Do not do again, never again. Therefore, memory is mobilized. And of course, you would say this ideological name might not deserve the name of memory. And actually, I would probably agree with you. Yeah, thank you for that, because I think this precision is necessary. I mean, if you read the book, it becomes very clear later that it was, but I put a couple of arguments here together. It should be read, I think, along and with, sometimes also against, Enzo Traverso's book on left melancholia. Enzo Traverso, I think, maybe I forgot him in the reading list. Yeah, the good German and the Philo-Semite, the anti-Semite. Very briefly, I think we need this passage. I mean, we actually tackled this a lot, but one more time in Robert Meister's words. The moral psychology of splitting your internal psychic life according to the logic of projective identification. He borrows this from Melanie Klein. So the moral psychology of splitting is central to Robert Meister's critique of fin de siècle human rights discourse. So basically the late 1990s. I argue that through the work of human rights trials and truth commissions, here South Africa, beneficiaries can live out the fantasy of loving loving one split of version of the victim and fearing the other, who can consequently be treated as a threat. There's a good victim I can identify with, and there's a bad victim that wants revenge. This I don't want. Yet for all of this, the whole victim never appears as an object of their affective thought. The point has been made by scholars of post-war Germany who note the rapidity with which philo-Semitism, the identification of Germany with its missing Jews, replaced, there's no guilt process here, an acknowledging of it, replaced anti-Semitism as a cultural norm. A post-war German political leadership that demonized Hitler and idealized the good German who mourns the vanished Jew made it possible for all Germans to keep the inner Jew alive. And for this inner Jew, they don't even need actual Jews. No, the fantasy of the Jew is enough. And if you need a material, if you want to substantiate it, you can actually at least call for Jewish immigration to Germany to, kind of a replacement or reforesting, to quote Hannah Zuberi's a brilliant article on that, reforestation, so to speak, of the missing Jew. But it is one version that is split off with which you can identify, not the one that wants revenge and sees you the beneficiary in the continuation of that of that past evil that now is openly repudiated in state-organized memory culture. And I'm talking only about this kind of memory culture. And we had this demonize the demonizers, the unreconciled remnants of an illiberal past, those victims who do not want to let go of their struggle for justice. Again, I had to think of Palestinian claim to land and return. In Germany, you hear this every day in the news. Why those people don't accept, oh my God, they lost something, be happy what you have and move on. So become a good victim, just, that we beneficiaries can show some compassion. But if you're an unreconciled victim, whatever atrocities are displayed live in your feed on your phone, no reaction. Then the thing doesn't work with that splitting of the victim. I'm skipping a bit. I know we're also a bit late already. By the way, who has other passages? I mean, I'm going here through, I obviously have a certain narrative in mind, and I'm reading the text with the news of every day, and there is a political, historical present that makes this text speak to me at this moment, and in this way I'm reading it. But there are other realities and readership, so please join me if you want me to focus on other passages. Otherwise, I would like to read out this one. To move here. It's the genocide in Gaza as a moral war of civilization against barbarism. I think you have heard it many times by Israeli politicians, also American. So the imaginability of genocide as a defense against the fear of genocide is a disturbing point to acknowledge. To say that genocide is morally intelligible, that it must be for us to fear it, is not to say that it is now or ever could have been morally justified. Instead, it is to note that most genocides are not mere acts of inadvertence or insensitivity, but rather moments of intense moral concentration invoking high concepts, including those of human rights and democracy, that are also invoked to keep the fear of genocide at bay. Doing a genocide to keep the fear of genocide at bay. Invoking civilization, human rights, entire Israeli state propaganda you can bracket in here. So genocide is in the name of the highest moral values, of course. Again, it follows the logic of demonizing the demonizers. And one more time, genocide is not an apolitical or depoliticized hate crime. No, it is a political procedure. It's a political goal. Of course, it's ideology, but I take it that people actually believe that. So kind of a holy war or whatever for they imagined a civilization. And by the way, this also holds for the Nazis, who had, a much crazier fantasy, but generally they also believe that they are relieving the world of some horrible people that they wanted to exterminate. Interesting point. I think it was this amazing, almost slip of the tongue. I don't know. There was this German dude, a journalist, who asked Francesca Albanese in one press conference when she said, "I have evidence of genocidal acts by the Israeli state," and he said, "Where is the document where they write, 'Let's exterminate the Palestinians'?" Completely crazy. Of course, everybody made fun of it, but so he took it for serious, for granted that those people who actually claim to defend Western civilization cannot do genocide, because that would be just a collateral damage. But again, from the genocidal mindset, every victim is collateral damage. These people are here to fulfill the historical mission of rescuing the world, getting rid of evil people, and so on and so on. And it fits very well with the language of the Human Rights Discourse. Behind this conclusion lies, what he has just laid out. The US policy, protection, intervention, human rights, human rights with weapon. Behind this conclusion lies the view that stopping evil rather than bringing justice has become the ethical basis for all politics, and that justice-based politics is justice-based politics discredits itself if it does not aim to stop evil first. So humanitarian intervention first, then we talk about politics. This view would not have been as broadly embraced in 2001 if the 20th century struggles over capitalism and colonialism had been active. Yes, he brings it in. Of course, struggles over capitalism and colonialism are active, and they are very active today. Therefore, we have a completely different response these days. Stopping evil relies on what is defined as evil. The beneficiary defines what is evil. And what is defined evil is precisely what those people who still engage in struggles over capitalism and colonialism fight for. That is justice. Justice is evil. I mean, if you go to the end of that, ideological conclusion, to point out capitalism and colonialism is anti-Semitic. And you have those people who say that. It's not as crazy as you think. Yeah, maybe there's also a good summary here. Today, the asserted priority of ethics over politics, and again, it's a very basic, emptied out notion of ethics. Purdue has also ethics. The Levinasian ethics is later discussed in length in the book, but let's call it, my God, moralized version of realpolitik. So today, the asserted priority of ethics over politics is based on the sacredness of human life, and it's symptomatic of a political condition in which defenselessness is presupposed. I guess you hear the echo of Walter Benjamin, Giorgio Agamben, and Hannah Arendt, and Homo Sac. I mean, this is very clear. The sacredness of human life is almost, I think, a literal quote of Benjamin's essay on the critique of violence. Remember the argument: once life is sanctified or is sacred, bare life emerges. That is exactly his argument, and that bare life is then culpable life, and that can be killed. And Agamben made a larger theory out of that. Human rights interventionism thus understands itself as a refusal to rationalize persecutory violence as one moment in a cycle in which states make war in order to make peace. Recent humanitarians regard the cyclicity of violence that begets violence, as itself the paradigm of evil, and views the rescue of innocent victims as a break in this cycle rather than a continuation of it. Again, this is from the perspective of the beneficiary. Cyclicity of violence only exists because there are some unreconciled victims who do not accept the offers, the symbolic offers of beneficiaries. Therefore, they are evil. Again, there was the split in the victim, good and bad. Bad one are those who insist on justice. Thus described, human rights have become a discourse of revelation followed by conversion that is modeled on certain Christian accounts of the cross. In these accounts, Christ's sacrifice is meant to reveal the cruelty of all sacrifice because the victim is innocent, and thus to bring the cycle of sacrifice to an end through concern for the suffering of humans as such. Love one another. The wars fought by professedly Christian rules would therefore become wars of rescue, crusading wars of peace aimed toward the return of the earlier cyclical forms of violence. Again, it's very important. This is a reading of Paul that is not a reading of Badiou, obviously. For those people, the significance of Christ is suffering and sacrifice, not the truth event that Badiou later in his book on St. Paul will mention, which is the real event of Jesus. That is his resurrection, obviously, the empty tomb. It's all about universalizing what you can't universalize, which is bodily singular suffering, the torture of the body. That's why he says it is a revelation followed by conversion. So to finally see this cyclicity of violence, and that there is no meaning in this suffering, torturing of the body, and this has to stop prior to all politics. But again, it's only worth for victims deemed good enough to be this split of good version of victim. Otherwise, you can torture as you wish. These are evil people. Oh, all Hamas, as they call it. There are no civilians and so on. You know all of this. For those who claim to be converted by the events of Auschwitz or Hiroshima, in Germany it's a very common trope actually to enter politics to be converted by the events of Auschwitz. New ways to save the innocent from the return from a return to 20th century violence are not more of the same. Instead, they are a way of bearing witness to the cyclicity of that violence so as to end it. Ethical wars are those fought by self-professed rescuers to oppose a cycle of violence and prevent those still engaged in it from obtaining the means of omnicide. Remember, Iranian weapons of mass destruction or Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, now generically called, in this new discourse of human rights, the ultimate evil is physical cruelty, the intentional infliction of bodily suffering. Consequently, the response to bodily suffering is the ultimate test of affirmative moral responsibility. Ethics, body, individual, singular, good victim. Bad is past evil as struggle for justice, as pointing to systemic violence and ongoing beneficiaries of that evil, and to engage in a fight for this. This is basically called cycle of violence. And from the perspective of this, the self-professed rescuers as beneficiaries of past evil have the right to intervene. So therefore, the human rights discourse here is a moralized version of textbook American invasion ideology. But I think, and that's why I'm rereading it again these days, it also shows us a lot of how the West treats the incredible violence, physical bodily violence of the current genocide that is also visible. I mean, it's very hard to, you can decide to look the other way, but it's almost impossible to escape these images. They're very cruel. Some people respond to it and say there's a humanitarian crisis, but I would never go for the political one, because these people are unreconciled victims. They're from past evil, and therefore, whatever you present them, they won't act on that. So all what you hear here is only for a clearly defined set of split of idealized victims, where this fantasy earlier in the book elaborated with Melanie Klein, projective identification works. Otherwise, no. Then they are just evil people. I skipped this one. I know it's already almost 10 here, or 10 to the hour. I think those who are interested in Levinas should really read this, or read it again. It's fascinating how the suffering body and the ethical impulse to intervene supersedes and replaces historical context. And those who followed the news after October the 7th will remember that those who pointed out that this has a prehistory, they were almost called anti-Semites. You know, it has to, here's the act, here's the martyred body, here I have to intervene. But of course, it has to be a good victim, no? The Palestinians, for obvious reasons, do not qualify. But there are other people who also do not qualify. It's just the most extreme case, because we see it every day. I mean, there are other cases, it's not only the Palestinian case, but I think here we can see the, let's say, negative transaction of which affect can flow which way, you know. To empathize with Palestinians these days needs first the procedure of splitting off the victim. You have to take away all political agency, and precisely the most dangerous agency of Palestinians who still are there and claim their land and point out to the foundational crime of Israel, of the state. And also in Germany, the first thing they say, show me those good Palestinians. I'm ready to defend and rescue them. But I don't see them. I see only, in this language, unreconciled evil victims. You know, we have to fear the rage of those people. We did so much to them. When they are in power, they're going to kill us. This paranoia is not completely irrational. I mean, it has obviously some references in reality. I just wanted one more quote to end this very, very dense chapter, which is here the summary, and two more quotes, and I will stop, and then we do a round. Sepideh, is it okay?
Yes, of course.
Okay. The Human Rights Discourse described in this chapter, so chapter 1, fits the needs of a globalization that regards the struggles over capitalism and colonialism as finished. The excesses of proximity are what the world market cannot tolerate, and integration of the local economy into global is the promised reward for violent societies that make the desired transition to a culture of human rights and a memory culture. My addition here. Instead of demanding justice now, the subject of transitional justice are expected to show patience and to understand that from the perspective of a watching world, the real point of that transition is to bring closure to the past. In Justice as Reconciliation, beneficiaries seek to rationalize the continuing advantage as an ethical repudiation of both the perpetrators, we did Nuremberg and stuff, or The Hague, of past evil, and the morally damaged victims who emerged from it. And the morally damaged victims, that is the fantasy that they fear most. We did harm to those people, or we benefited from the deeds of those who did harm to these people. These people are morally damaged. When they come in power, they're gonna send us to the camps or whatever, this is the idea. I think this sums it up. One more quote, because it's the introductory quote of chapter 5 that I also wanted to discuss, but I know it was a bit too optimistic. But he has a very good summary of his presentation up to here. And I mean, these are the most important points for me, to just get an entry point into reading Robert Meister. This other chapter, as you saw, Never Again, I also find it super interesting, especially what he says about trauma, compassion, and on Badiou, especially Badiou versus Levinas, and how he can criticize both from a Schmittian perspective and in the end also criticize Schmitt himself. It's quite good. But anyways, I'll just read out this and we'll end with that. Primeval. So here he says in the beginning of chapter 5, Never Again. In previous chapters, I have suggested that human rights discourse opposes a polemical concept of the ethical to the 20th century concept of the political, which, as Carl Schmitt conceded, was also polemical. Human rights discourse, I have argued, is against the ideologies of both revolution and counter-revolution, the cyclicity of violence, that dominated much of the 20th century, even while it indirectly carries on significant parts of the counter-revolutionary project. Very significant parts. To point this out is to criticize human rights discourse for its historical specificity. By calling attention to the forms of justice it excludes, often surreptitiously, in putting beneficiaries on the same footing as potential victims and allowing them to disavow their links with perpetrators. I think this is the most important part of this book. Exclude certain forms of justice, and this is precisely to do justice to capitalism and colonialism, but also to other forms of oppression and, let's call it, structural violence or systemic violence. This is excluded. To narrow down what is actually justice, and even to bring it into juridical terms and language of the human rights discourse. And to put beneficiaries, those who actually still benefit from past evil and also ongoing evil, on the same footing as potential victims. I mean, this is really incredible. You have this very often in debates that, you know, people with good passports and actually who benefit from the situation talk to people who are at risk, as if there would be a both sadism, you know, like a false balance arguments. We have this a lot. Maybe I stop here. There is a lot, but maybe we do another session one day. I can only maybe my plaidoyer. It is a difficult book, as a very convoluted book, but it's really worth reading it, and I think it should be read with regard to political urgency and need, not just for studies or for intellectual interests only, even though it is very interesting. I mean, in terms of what it brings together from the fields of political theory, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. Maybe I end here for the moment. If you want to move on, I can only say, please read those passages again, 155 onwards. Maybe we can talk about in a final round now. Yeah, maybe I stop here.
Thank you so much. Sami, do you want to end the session, or you would like to answer more questions? Because I know it's 3 hours already and it's really
I know.
late.
I'm on holidays actually, and I have to go downstairs to meet my family.
Okay.
Yeah, but you know, I'm not saying I'm enjoying that, but I say I like the book, and it's a certain type of enjoyment because I think it helps me to read the current situation. And also when preparing this session today, I had so many associations while reading it, and I think it's also a reading experience I can't really share with you because you have to read it. So in the end, what I can do is just scratch the surface and share. Maybe it's not an enthusiasm, it's actually a very dark book. It's really dark. It's much darker. It gets darker the more you read it. And this is from 2011. And that's why I think a very prophetic book that tells you so much about our current historical moment. Anyways, I would like to answer questions that are on specific passages where we can actually share our understanding or miss our non-understanding of passages. But other things we can maybe delay for another session. Collective memory, we had that. Jack Serbas, maybe too much of a sidetrack, and maybe curious if you could explain more on the position of anti-Deutsch. Yeah, thank you, Jack, because this was the quote I wanted just to read. Come on, let's do it. I will end with another quote, which is on 155, and then I will really end, I promise. Yeah? There's much more to say, but let's also not feature these people too much. So there is this interesting passage. I think it's a quote by Badiou. He starts, the discussion is, can the Holocaust be an event? Badiou says no, because it's not universalizable. There's no universal meaning in it. So it's not a truth event. There's nothing positive in it. So you cannot turn this Nazi genocide into something good. It is also like kind of the zero level of historical meaning. But again, of course, memory culture of the Holocaust claims the otherwise. They even want to create some pedagogical thing, let's say, pedagogical value out of it. So, and now he has this passage. I think it's in Ethics or in the Century. You have to check it out in the PDF. Renegades of the leftism of the 70s, and I'm talking about the Anti-Deutsch, or the Nouveau Philosophe, who remain inconsolable that revolution has ceased to be the name of every authentic event, are busy turning the extermination of the Jews by the Nazis into the single and sacred event of the 20th century, identifying anti-Semitism as the destinal content of the history of Europe, turning the word Jew into the victimizing designation of a surrogate absolute, and the word Arab, barely hidden behind the word Islamist, into the designation of the barbarian. And I think this is very clearly describing what conversion the Anti-Deutsch did, and why, and what kind of a universal project being substituted by the singularity effect of a negative truth event. And so, if you want to be very polemical, you can say the October Revolution has been substituted by the negative truth event of the revelation of Auschwitz. As crazy as it is, but that would be the logic.
It's fully crazy, and it's so puzzling. It remains puzzling. It's hard to wrap your mind around it. It's such a strange conversion, but this is very clear. This is very well stated. Yeah, I kept wondering about it, about anti-Deutsche position, but this makes it very clear.
Yeah, I mean, me too. But I mean, it is part of I think this historical transition to what is here called the human rights discourse. You can say the anti-Deutsch are the latecomer converts to the human rights discourse who still produce a rhetoric of revolution, of old evil, while having accepted the terms of the new HRD, which makes them kind of a tragic, but also kind of ridiculous, farcical figure. But anyways, I would also take a proper. Ray Brassier did great work on it, and also during the Bikar assembly on Palestine in Beirut in June, we talked about this a lot. So you can see there are a lot of loose threads that are put here together, but I think I center it still around a certain reading and rereading of Meister's book and his sources. But I take your point. We have 10 o'clock. I mean, at least on the Euro time here, on a Sunday, I'm gonna let you go.
Thanks a lot, Sami. It was great.
I hope we meet in person this summer. I'm here in Europe, actually. So maybe even in the Netherlands, or at least Belgium. Let's see.
Hope to see you.
Good to see you. And Sepideh, thank you so much